Hello, everybody. This is Jeff Koshin West from Integral Transformative Bodywork. I want to welcome you to another event of Sunday School. It is August 23rd, 2020, and we're here back again. Just for some logistics, if you'd like to make a donation, please go to embodyingitb.org, and you should find some links for donations there. You may also find links to donations in the YouTube description portion when this video is posted. Donations are not expected. We appreciate it. Donations don't go directly to me. They go to Integral Transformative Bodywork and our activities and our affiliates associated. So that's where that goes. Today, we are going to focus on a topic that's can sometimes be a little bit sensitive, but also is a very, very near and dear topic to me. It's about having to do with stage development and shamanic practices or shamanism in general, and asking that question of what is an integral shaman. A lot of what we do in ITB is I have categorized as integral shamanic practices or integral shamanism. And there's a lot of questions about what does that mean? How does that unfold, and what's the difference? What's the point of calling it integral shamanism? So we're going to talk about some definitions, our general definition of integral shamanism, of shamanic when we use the term shamanic in ITB, and then also how we relate it to the stage development model put down by Don Beck. And based off of the work of Carl Graves, and we're going to kind of talk about that a little bit more and look at that situation and talk about why we use such a term like integral shamanism. I'm trying to get myself in my seat correctly here. All right, so to begin, let's first and foremost talk about the umbrella term of what we mean by shamanism or shamanic. Originally, this term was brought up having to do with Siberian. The term shaman is actually the name for a medicine carrier in what I believe to be a Siberian indigenous tribe, and has since kind of blown up into an umbrella having to do with practices and skill sets associated with our ancient people's traditions. And so if we look at any strong, enduring tradition of ancient peoples, especially pre-verbal, like before they started doing a whole lot of historical documentation or started to do where cultures where oral history was the real foundations of their tradition and foundations of their education, back into that era, we're talking very, very long period of time. Very long period of time ago. And so this is having to do with the medicine and technology that kind of emerged from those cultures and from those traditions. It has obviously evolved over the thousands of years that we've been kind of engaging it and processing that information. It has definitely evolved, but it is, for us in ITB, it is an umbrella term. Shaman or shamanic practices, shamanism, these things are an umbrella term for these types of skill sets that we found in those indigenous traditions and that are still alive in a lot of those indigenous traditions. And so let's see, what else did I want to say with that? The other reality, the reason we use this term shamanism or shamanic practices is because what has over the years, what we've come to realize is that if we step back a little bit and look at a worldview of the practices of the ancient peoples or the indigenous peoples of planet Earth, what we start to notice is a kind of a startling common thread, a common set of practices, a lot of common activities, a lot of common practices that start to emerge, and we find that to be terribly interesting. We start to think of that in a different type of a way beyond just a cultural grounding of those traditions. We start to causes us to start to really reflect upon what if these human beings during this period of time at this stage of development and understanding of the cosmos, what if they were really just tapping into and performing activities that are primary to the human experience in relationship to interacting with reality. So how we may want to talk about that in a little bit of a different way, if that seems a little bit abstract, is what we notice is that in all ancient people's traditions, there seems to be the use of altered states of consciousness, what we call ASCs. And ASC or ASCs, these altered states of consciousness seem to be primary to the human experience. And in a lot of these ancient people's traditions, that was the vehicle in which they performed a lot of their medicine, a lot of their divination, a lot of their um, decision-making process and unpacking how to interact with reality, how to interact with the natural world. So we see very, very common practices starting to show up as far as altered states are concerned. They would use their breath. Okay, so they would dance, they would exercise, they would chant, they would sing, they would do something along those lines in order to really get the breath going. So there would be breath changes going on. Oftentimes, the ASCs were definitely included in activities of isolation, sometimes either burying or enclosure activities. So what we mean by burying and enclosure activities, there oftentimes was an altered state experience when participating in these common activities, these altered state activities. What we noticed was they either would bury a person, put a person into the earth or into the ground, or bury them with something else for a period of time, and to allow for the trance experience, the altered state experience to go through and for an experience to emerge. And or they would collect in a structure of some kind. And we see this once again around the world. We have seen very, very specific structures made just for the prayer process or the communion process or the use of altered state skill practices. And so we would see, like an example would be like a sweat lodge in northern Native American traditions, specifically coming from a lot of what's living these days is the Lakota tradition. But for the the indigenous folks of northern Native America, there wasn't just one type of lodge. If you went around the country, around the continent, there were all different types of lodges that kind of emerged. And all those very much depended on how their tradition was. The other thing we see is in different portions of the world, we see from Australia to Africa, even into the Americas, we see a burying process, a putting a person in the earth, submerging a person in the earth, digging a hole, putting them in the earth. And that was a sacred act, or that was a healing act of some kind or another. And so this is what we mean by a burying or an enclosure type of an experience. So they varied a good deal and in several traditions around the world. There would usually be if you were going through some kind of rite of passage, whether that was a maturation from child to adulthood or maturation into a certain community or a certain role, oftentimes the individual or individuals would have to go and build a structure, spend time in that structure for a certain period of time. Sometimes that structure was built by them. Sometimes the structure was built prior to and then just added to by the current participant or participants. So these are very, very common type of practices, very common threads throughout all cultures. And we noticed that was very, very curious. And other people, not just myself, but many others, had noticed that there seems to be this common theme that starts to show up in these ancient people's traditions. And that's what we kind of mean when we talk about shamanism or shamanic practices, is this kind of umbrella of how globally there seems to be an agreement about things that go on as far as these ancient people's traditions are concerned, and that they are natural to the human phenomenon on planet Earth. A lot of these basic skills have to do with communing with whatever they perceived as higher power or elements in the environment, journeying, going on, shifting into an ASC and going to adventure somewhere else, either depending on the language, either out of the body into a different world or deeper into the body, depends on the language of the tradition. Relating and this generally encapsulates this idea of how they related or translated the ocean of consciousness that was around them, or a spirit that was around them, or higher power that was around them. And these were their forms, and this is what every ancient peoples have, what every religion has in its origins, are these practices of ancient peoples of planet Earth on every continent. They show up everywhere. And so that's what we mean by shamanic or shamanism when we talk about it in ITB. It's not trying to take a certain culture, take just an individual culture. Usually we speak directly at that culture and name that culture when we kind of speak to that. But we're kind of speaking in a very, very diverse, very inclusive, very broad type of an evaluation of ancient people's traditions on the planet. So that's what we mean by that. And we hope that that kind of stays clear as we go through this process. The next thing we have to kind of touch on is something called stage development. Stage development in Western psychology and also in other traditions into the East have considered the question of, do humans evolve in a certain pattern, and how does that pattern unfold? Out of the East, you see different wisdom traditions throwing their hat in the ring, suggesting different things. One of the more popular ones is the chakra system. The chakra system in some traditions, some Ayurvedic traditions and wisdom traditions out of India and the East in general, will talk about a person, quote unquote, activating a chakra from age to age. So as they start at when they're a child, they may not have access or awareness of a certain chakra in the body, and that they start from the bottom and start moving upwards as the years tick by, as the body changes, as the human changes, and as the psyche changes, as the spirit changes, we could say. So this is a suggestion that comes up as far as stage development is concerned. We do see some evidence in the rest of the East, portions of the Asiatic continents, moving into different portions of, considering China and traditional Chinese medicine, and into Japan and into the different haras and the different portions of the body having to do with energy centers, and having access to those as the human ages and different things along those lines. So stage development does show up there. In the West, we look at a little bit of a different type of a conversation as far as developmental psychology is concerned, talking about how, once again, the similar conversation of how does a human evolve from an infant to a quote unquote adult and into the elder years, and how that looks and how that unfolds, both from a physiological but then also a psychological perspective. And there are different schools of thought in relationship to that. Today we're going to point to the work of Dr. Clare Graves and his conversation of spiral dynamics. His work continues to be pushed forward by a gentleman by the name of Don Beck. Clare Graves, the reason we're going to point to spiral dynamics, and we're going to talk about spiral dynamics, is because Clare Graves did something kind of exciting. Clare Graves took an evaluation of social centers and social phenomenon. And as he took more and more research and assessment of this, he started to notice specific stages or portions of a spiral of human development as well as cultural development starting to emerge. So this is kind of opposite from how a lot of other stage development models kind of were birthed. Oftentimes, there's a hypothesis that's put out in front of how that stage development unfolds, and then we fit data into that category and try and manipulate the data and put that in place. Clare Graves' research on stage development is pointed to as some of the best research that's been done on stage development, and providing the strongest evidence for a lot of that. So his research that he performed is heralded as a wonderful resource of unbiased, valuable research information, and that's how he put his model together. And so he took the model based off of what the science said, rather than having a model in mind and then looking for science to confirm his suspicion. So Clare Graves' scientific method was, very, very well applied and judiciously managed. And that's why we point to him, and that's why most likely his evidence that he points out paints a very interesting and helpful picture in relationship to trying to translate reality, right? And so we're going to kind of look at Don Beck's work and spiral dynamics work, and we're going to talk about stage development. And some things to know off the bat about stage development when you're looking at stage development information. It can be kind of daunting to look at because it is hierarchical. It is a progression of sophistication. It's a progression of focus of values is a progression of fairness. It's a progression of intelligence, a progression of use of resources and engagement of resources. So when we look at stage development, the first thing people get turned off about it is they think, oh, this is a wonderful tool for oppression. And my first response is like, yeah, well, yeah, sure, certainly it could be seen as a tool of repression, and I hear you as far as that's concerned, but also, you know, there's tons of very, very positive things that can be tools of repression. Okay, social media, basic education, textbooks, these things can be phenomenal, but they can also be tools for repression. So we oftentimes want to take information as information, and remember that information is just information, and it's not inherently evil or inherently bad. It's just simply pointing out the reality of a situation. We want to kind of look at this experience when we look at stages of development. We look at stage development. We really want to treat it as this bit of information that's useful for understanding our experience and understanding others. The thing that we want to be really clear about as far as healthy transformation or healthy development of an individual is that every stage transcends yet includes the stage that came before it. So we need to keep this idea, this integral concept in mind that Wilber pushes a whole lot from integral theory. Is true healthy growth is transcend and include, transcend and include, transcend and include. So a really good example to parrot some of Wilber's suggestions is if you're going to learn how to read, you have to learn about the alphabet. You have to start with learning letters and sounds and what those letters represent as far as the sounds are concerned. And when you complete the education of your alphabet and information having to do with the alphabet, you don't toss that out and say, well, screw letters, I'm really only interested in words. That's not how that works. We take letters and then we use them to create words, and then we unpack words and spell words, and that's how we get words. So we include the education that we took before to use it to make something more sophisticated, more dynamic, more, right? And then the same thing happens with words. Like words, we put together, we start to master words, and we master letters, we start to master words, and then we start to put together sentences or put together phrases. And as we start to model and create phrases and learn really well how to handle phrases and handle sentence structure and build sentences, we don't look at letters or words and individually and we say, oh, screw those are useless, I don't need words anymore, I've got sentences. It's just not how we hope to think of this stage development. We want to remember this is an inclusive process. So a lot of the experiences, to put it in actual human experience, a lot of the experiences you gathered from crawling and a lot of the motor activity that you refined from, we all, I should say, not just you, but all of us refined from crawling, from doing different activity of spreading our arms and using our arms and legs in different fashions, learning to crawl, learning to pull ourselves up, learning to balance. All that stuff contributed to our then walking and running and use of, you know, a bipedal experience. So it's not like we said, screw crawling. I'm never going to crawl again. I'm never going to lay on my stomach again. I'm never going to lay down again. I'm a walker. I'm a runner. The reality is that we build on those things to evolve into something more complex, into something more exciting, into something more rich and full, and thus more complex. So we never want to look at this kind of stage development information as in, you know, I passed that, I went through that stage and now I'm on another stage and screw that old stage. That's definitely not the thing we're trying to pay attention to, nor are we trying to, as we touched on a second ago, look at this information and use it to repress other things. So we don't want to repress the crawlers. The walkers don't want to repress the crawlers, right? It's not like it's appropriate. So now that we can walk and run, we have the opportunity to suppress and repress and, you know, keep those crawlers in their place. That's not how we want to kind of approach that whole process. This is more of a ethical, moral conversation than an actual recognition of stage development as it emerges and as it unfolds for human beings. So as we can kind of touch on, and as we're kind of already illustrating, the material we're learning about stage development can be used in a very helpful way to inform, to create healthy lifestyle, to create healthy relationships, or it can be used in a really sinister way and create shitty relationships and create oppressive relationships to other, dominant relationships with other people, adversarial relationships with other human beings or creatures or whatever. So we're not really interested in creating a lot of that stuff. It's when we look at stage development, we really just kind of want to honor it as data, and not an end-all be-all data, but just data. It's information contributing to the translation of this great event that we're all in, this living experience of evolution that we're all in. So these are some pitfalls that we run into with stage development. They're very hard to not fall into because most human beings have been taught to do very adversarial relationships. Early stages of development are very adversarial in general. Seem to have a real flavor for competition and adversarialism. So that's a hang up that we can bump into every once and again. And we hope to minimize that, but that can come up a fair bit. But here we go into some stage development. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. And we're going to take a look at stage development. So here we are. So this is very pretty. This is a spiral, zippity-doo. And we have our stage development here on the left. Hopefully you'll be able to read this on your screen. This should come through relatively clear. You may have to, if you're on your phone, you may have to zoom in a little bit. But this is going to tell us the story of stage development here on planet Earth. And this is the suggestion offered up by the research collected by Claire Graves and Don Beck in that community of researchers. So when we talk about shamanism, when we talk about stage development in relationship to shamanism or shamanic practices, that we're looking back at the earliest portions of human history here. We're looking at this beige purple type of territory of stage development for humanity. And this is going back several thousand years, as you can tell by the remarks. Let me see if I can actually zoom in a little bit more. I'm going to have to take a second to, pardon me one second. I am going to have to zoom in a little bit more so we can have a good time. And I'm going to put that away. And we can maybe read it a little bit better here. So at the earlier stage of development, very long time ago, we run into this the origins of shamanic and recovery and medicine as we know it here in the natural world. We run into the beginnings of the human world, of the idea of us getting together and spending time together and creating communities, creating tribes in the purple and the beige purple territory of history, but then also the experience of humans in reality. A lot of the interests that we have is, especially when it comes to shamanism, is back in that era of time, there were human beings that perceived reality in a literal way, that there were spirits of things in the world. There were, since they didn't have our language and our access to language the way we did about scientific method and kind of seeing behind the curtain of the momentum of forces in the world, their perception of reality was based off of the information that they had available. So when clouds came, when the sun rose, when animals moved through their herding habits and different things along those lines, and populations of animals replenished themselves or died off, plants regrew or came back, oftentimes based off of their historical experience and off of their data that was available to them at that point in time, their experience was that there was an actual spirit, there was a literal spirit there pushing that forth or pulling that back in. So a good example of this is there is in some hunting traditions, there was this belief that, let's say the the tribe that was doing the hunting and the hunting tribe were going after a deer form of something along those lines. And as they interacted with that deer, what they would do is they would create this, they had this perception that there was actually a single deer, there was a single spirit of the deer in which all deer sprouted from. So they kind of came from that place. They kind of knew that that deer reproduced themselves, but they did literally believe that if you went back far enough through that history of that species, of those people, of those creatures, you would find an individual spirit that lived and roamed on the land. and was aware of what was going along with its group. Okay, so knew that the tribe of deer, of those four-leggeds, what was going on with them and what they were needing and what was happening and who was feeding on them and who was maybe abusing them and different things along those lines. So there was literally the belief that if you got the chance, you would actually spot that spirit in the world and you could have an interaction of that, and it was considered a literal thing. And that was how they made their world. And so what they would oftentimes do is they would oftentimes make prayers to appease and to create a warm relationship with that spirit of those animals. So as they did this act of killing and taking the life of one of those creatures and one of those family members, it was understood that they weren't doing it willy-nilly. They weren't doing it out of anything but survival and of caring for their own people and caring for their own tribe and their own community, and to create a warm relationship and a healthy relationship of, granted, we have to take this life, but all of nature takes life to a certain extent. And it was this orientation of, we're going to make sure that we do this in a sacred, and from their perspective, a sacred way in relationship to this group of creatures that they were taking the lives of. And so they would do celebrations, they would do representations, they would do honorings, they would do prayers, they would do different types of rituals and different things along those lines to appreciate the energy of the life of those creatures, the energy of those creatures. And this is where, you know, a lot of that, like it says here, animistic magic type of an experience actually started with shamanism. These are most likely the real origins. This beige and purple world is the origins of shamanism, also the origins of our relationship to reality as our human experience kind of began. So we're going to kind of also tie through stage development, which is also really cool. We can tie the connections historically up into present day of how every stage that evolved after these purple and beige territories kind of built off of that information that the purple and beige communities were working on, kind of setting a foundation of consciousness and foundation of human thought in relationship to the perception of reality. And so you had oftentimes at this purple beige territory, it was very much oriented towards taking care of a positive relationship between the gods, between the sources of power, the spirits that were in the environment, and making sure that they appeased them, that they were in order, their relationship was ordered with them. And if bad things happened in the tribe, it was because the relationship to the spirits were off or something along those lines. The relationship to the gods was off. And this is all very petitionary, all very like appeasement oriented as far as the gods were concerned, and was clearly a different experience, and a literal experience as well, similar to how we have some folks who literally believe that Moses parted the Red Sea, or literally believe that some holy figure ascended or performed some incredible miracle, or like in the context of Jesus is sitting on a throne somewhere, there's God somewhere, you know, judging the heck out of people. Or that, you know, what was his name? Lao Tzu was born like in 500 or 600 or 800-year-old baby child wisdom keeper. So these kind of myths were taken literally, and these, at this stage of development, it appears that this was a very literal type of experience. This was very real for them. As we kind of evolve, shamanism kind of evolved, and we started to see the movement from a magic animistic type of a relationship to higher power, to spirits, to gods, and we started to see more and more of an evolution and an expression of the early mystical traditions, which gave birth to our religions. And we see still some shamanism, still, you know, still purple beige shamanic stuff starting to emerge. We do still definitely start to see the emergence of something of powerful storytelling, of powerful archetypes starting to show themselves. Like it mentions here, the major quest, or the major motivation for a lot of human beings at this stage of development is going to be heroic status, how their relationship to power, glory, rage, and revenge. And so we see really the emergence of a big storytelling as far as a human taking control and taking up power in a different way, taking over control and almost moving into godlike spaces and holy spaces, and being seen as a god or as a deity. And we start to see this emerging more and more at this stage of development in history. And so shamanism still looks a lot like that beige purple type of stage of development. There's still a lot of appeasement going on, but the appeasement may be shifted to the gods, to a representative of the gods, maybe a king or a queen or an emperor, empress, or something along those lines. That was considered the embodiment of that god. But shamanism still looks pretty similar. You still see a lot of the altered states of consciousness coming through. You still see the altered states of consciousness and practices in service to, or being given to the empire or the keeper of the realm, something along those lines. And we were starting to see, instead of at the purple and beige type of territory, we started to see this alignment with power, meaning that the more you aligned with power, the more powerful you are. Now, a lot of the purple and beige shamanic practices that still endure now are not very power hungry. The humans function in a certain way, and if they are given power, it's usually given by a deity or given by a creature or a spirit only for a period of time, and then they're kicked back down to just being humans, right? They're just a human wandering around. When we started seeing more of this activity happening with the red, we started to see a different emergence occur. So you could be crowned a king or queen, and then, or empire or emperor or empress, and you were basically aligned with the spirits, aligned with God, aligned with that power, and so you can wield power the way it was perceived they could perform. And so the hero's journey really started to emerge really strongly here. We started to see more and more kind of a engraving of this into the human culture, into human consciousness, and the emergence of these communities, these empires started to emerge, and we had this type of history unfolding. So shamanism lived within that territory, still a lot of altered states, a lot of substance use. Shamanism was usually passed down in a community. It was very shamanism, as we talk about it lived within schools, it lived within practices, and those schools oftentimes then emerged as religions if those religions were not already in place. And so oftentimes we saw this coalescing of religion and shamanic experiences, these altered states of consciousness mixing with what we would consider religious orientations and religious practices and things like that. And so we saw kind of a bonding there as red gave way to blue at the rule and roll stage of development for these cultures. And for shamanism, what we started to notice that shamanism started to oftentimes shift from that kind of overlap of religion and shamanism and religion overlapping into each other. We started to see a decrease of this, and we started to see the emergence of religion as being more important than the shamanic practices. We started seeing more and more writing about religion, what one teacher spoke about that religion, how you ought to perform as far as that religion is concerned. And as far as the shamanic emergence was concerned, or the shamanic tradition was concerned, it was very personal. It was a very personal experience. You were interacting with spirit or higher power or ocean of consciousness or great mystery, and you were participating in that stuff. And that how you did that was a very personal type of a thing. When we started to see more religion come online, and more kind of dominance of that, and more focus on the words of the religion or of the teachers, or the written down practices of a religion, it became a little bit less personal, became a little bit less our own experience, and more of a make sure you conform to these guidelines and adhere to these guidelines. So shamanism, when it hits the blue stage development, shamanism doesn't look very much like this old school shamanism, purple beige territory whatsoever. It's what we start to notice is that shamanism becomes less flamboyant and interpersonal and unique to the person, and starts to show up in organized religions, starts to show up in those territories, and starts to still use altered states of consciousness, but the ASC experience oftentimes has to be within a certain confine of the blue stage of development. So it has to look a certain way, or else it might be perceived as demonic or useless or problematic in some form or fashion, maybe demonized in some way, to maybe condemned in some way. But shamanism endures. You know, we don't, oftentimes the ASCs that emerge at these stages of development in these religious traditions are called, saints would have these experiences, or deep believers would have these experiences of ecstatic expression, ecstatic releases. Euphoric states would overtake them. The God would take over their body, or the spirits would take over their body, or angels would take over their body, depending on how they talked about their deities and their higher power relationships. They would talk about them being extremely ecstatic. They would talk about them being huge insights from higher power and different things along those lines. And we would see these experiences kind of laced in that conversation. How much they were used to support the group or support the people was relative to the environment, or the culture that they were emerging in. So back here, back in the day, in these early areas of even red stages of development in cultures, definitely in the purple beige territory, the shaman or the shamanic practitioner, when they used these ASCs, they would oftentimes do this, as I mentioned earlier, to commune with what was going on in the natural environment, to commune with higher power, the ocean of consciousness that surrounded them. And in communing with that, would oftentimes, the point of them communing with that, I should say, it had to do with being able to gather information to better the tribe, gather information about what to do as far as planting is concerned, gather information about how to deal with maybe a sickness that was in the tribe. There was oftentimes, it was performed in service to the group, to the community, to the tribe, in order to create stability and to serve the tribe and all that jazz. It was also used to create healing and to create insight and to support health and longevity and the progress of the tribe. That was how it was used, and that's a perfectly appropriate way of using it. As it made it through red and into blue, it started to, because religion was the thing that was turned to, religion and religious practices and religious hierarchy and perspectives of how to do life, not hierarchy, but religious codes and morals and ethics were in place and written down. It was not very much questioned. This is how you were supposed to act, so act this way. And so only certain people maybe had the opportunity to move into that territory, and it definitely wasn't offered up as well, not definitely, but it was not as often offered up as this healing for the community or healing for an individual. It was not as strongly suggested as being the thing where they commune with the nature and then they come back and tell us how to do those things, how to proceed as a culture. So the role started to shift a little bit. But what we also know is that ASCs are primal to every human being. That's what's exciting about ASCs, is that they are free to everyone. So there's a great suspicion that even though shamanism changed its form throughout this development, from beige up into blue, shamanism still existed in different territories where it was permitted. So where it might not have been in the blue stage development, rules and rules stage development, it might not have been as permitted to go into altered states and to experience altered states and to take an hallucinogen to go into an altered state in formal areas. A lot of the basics of shamanism and shamanic practices started to push into territories where they were accepted. And one of the more consistent areas that they were accepted, especially here in the West, they pushed into territories of the arts, of even into the sciences, arts and sciences, of exploring different territories and tasting different experiences. And the creative experiences that artists had, whether they were in theater or writing or painting or whatever. And as the arts evolved from that blue stage into the orange stage of more sophistication, we definitely started to see, since some of those altered states were more acceptable in those territories, they started showing up in those territories a little bit more. This is also one of the reasons why in some of these blue cultures, even some of the blue portions of the US that we live in now, the arts are not supported, because as the artist or whatever, the artist of any form, any medium, moves into those altered states, they can be very scary. They can look very weird to a culture or a group or a person that is very much identifies with that blue rules or roles stage of development. That's, you know, in the rules, and if I didn't preface this well enough, the rules and roles stage development, an individual or group is very interested in, this is the regiment of how you do life. This is the story of how you do life. And if you're outside of that story, you're in trouble. You're going to go to hell. You're going to have problems with higher power. Moreover, on this plane of existence of the physical realm, we're probably going to put you in some type of you're probably going to, there's going to be consequences to you breaking those guidelines and those rules. And so if you're looking for a word that really encompasses a lot of these, a lot of that blue rules and roles stage development, think of a person who's very strict and fundamental in their religion or in their ethics, where it's, in our day and age, we say this is a person who sees the world very black and white. There's right and wrong, and the conversation of gray is not a good one. To be in the gray is bad. Because you're not in the red, you're not in the black side or the white side, you're not in the good side or the bad side, you are in the gray, and you either want to be on the good side or unfortunately be on the bad side. And so a person in this stage of development, or a group of people or a culture in this blue stage of development, it's great if you're on the good side. It's usually stable, it's very a lot of needs are provided. It's much more sophisticated than the cultures that came before it. But as it mentions in this description, it's a very nation state based, and it's very authoritarian in its way of doing things. So you have an authority, and the authority says what goes, and that's kind of how that occurs. There's a lot of positive stuff that comes up in this evolutionary process. There's more and more use of laws to uphold things. There's much more of a lineage that you can tap into. There's a lot of positive things that come from these territories. There's a lot of stabilization of the human, for an individual and for a culture, a lot of stabilization of identity, a lot of stabilization of education, a lot of stabilization of different skills and schools of practice of the human domain that start to emerge. As long as they're, you know, okay by that group or that culture. You can have a very rigid blue culture, or you can have a relatively open blue culture. You know, the right and wrong is a little bit more inclusive compared to right and wrong being very rigid. So this is where we see the majority of ancient traditions. We can look at something like a blue rules and roles stage of development culture that could be considered very inclusive. Would be something that we could look at is the Iroquois Nation. The Iroquois Nation here in the North American continent. The Iroquois Nation was a pretty inclusive culture. So there were actually several on the North American continent. There were actually there were a few very sophisticated, very inclusive blue stages of development, pushing into green stage of development cultures that emerged, that were living in that were on this land and functional and in a high functioning, quite honestly. And then there was also more rigid blue role stages of development and or cultures that were also very red oriented, that were a little bit less inclusive, a little bit more rigid about how to do things. A great example of that for those ancient tribes were the Blackfoot community. They were pretty specific about how you're supposed to do things. They were very warlike. They were very power focused. They were very tough, warrior based culture. And as you move, and as a culture moves into that blue role stage development, it's a little bit of a different story. It's just it's a different focal point. And there's a larger government that starts to arise, a larger governing, a larger, more complex interaction that starts to emerge. So for blue stage development, that's really wonderful stuff. For human beings, the individual, this is a very important age where the individual really starts to ask that question of, what are the rules of being around people and how do I fit into the world? So what's my role is a very important question. That what my role is an important question of not only where do I fit in, but where do I belong? And this is a question of what type of person I am. Who am I? As far as the rules is concerned, we want to learn the rules. So we can receive love. We want to learn the rules so we can find some experience of success. We want to learn the rules so if a rule, we want to learn the rules so we can perform and make sure that we fit in and participate. So by learning the rules and honoring the rules, then I can be more accepted and fit in better. And that's wicked important to an identity. I know there's some people out there that may think, you know, I'll never fit in, I never fit in. And that's actually kind of bullshit. You fit into definite territories. You might have fit in with a kind of a radical crew, or you might maybe fit into a specific niche of people, but you fit into a group. You found a space to fit into. Every human being goes through the storyline of where do I fit in? Some people fit into territories where they find large groups that they fit into. Other people find very small groups that they fit into and very niche groups that they fit into. But everybody fits somewhere. That's the idea of the rules and role stage development. And so on the individual, that's a very important story to figure out who the heck am I? Who am I going to become? And that continues to show up as we move into that orange stage development. So if we're thinking of shamanism and shamanic experiences as we go through the ages, we go from a very, very, very instinctual, basic experience of the environment, an altered state experience of the environment, and it kind of pushes through this territory up into that blue stage onto the orange, and it just becomes, shamanic practices, like everything else, just become more and more sophisticated. At least that's what the healthy version of it ought to be. Now, in American culture, shamanism got kicked out the door. Shamanism hid, if you will, in the world of the arts. That was more acceptable to be for altered states of consciousness to wander into the artistic community. So if we look at a culture like the culture that was around in the 40s, 50s, and 60s at this great emergence of a new territory, what we noticed is that shamanism was living in only in certain areas. It was only okay for you to perform and act in these ways that were altered and strange and very dynamic, as long as you were doing it in a certain territory. So dancers, singers, musicians of different times, painters, poets, writers, these folks were, in the best case scenario, they were given permission to be more dynamic and participate in a different way in the world and explore altered experiences. You know, if they were strange and eccentric, they were given, in some cases, they were given a pass because they were, all right, well, the community said, well, they're an artist, or they're a musician, or they're a painter, or they're a writer. So of course they're going to be a little bit strange or something like that. That was the best case scenario. Worst case scenario, you would see them locked up or killed, burned at stakes, different things along those lines, in some form or fashion, attacked and murdered oftentimes. So that's the worst case scenario: tortured, attacked, and murdered. Did these altered state people experience this? And so as the shamanic experiences, altered states, and these practices of communing and journeying and tapping into this creative energy, tapping into this altered state experience to get whatever, to provide whatever, as this hit blue and then moved into orange, we started to see a little bit of a freedom that emerges in the orange, because as we mentioned before, every stage transcends and includes the next one. So for the rules and roles stage of development, what healthy process through the healthy development through the rules and roles stage development should be the realization that rules and roles are positive, but they're only positive within the domain that they are positive in. So rules, some rules are to be upheld, other rules can be bendable, and some rules are meant to definitely change with the times. And it's very similar to boundaries, learning boundary experiences and having healthy boundaries with self and other. So the rules and roles stage development is very much about maintaining boundaries and exploring boundaries and stabilizing boundaries and asking that question of, is this a rule that I can play with? Is this a rule that shouldn't be messed with all that much, or can only be broken in very, very, very specific situations? Does this rule suck and is outdated? And does this rule negate certain people and dehumanize certain people or things and cause us risk, and we should get rid of it? So rules and role stage development, we should transcend that, but include it. We don't want to get rid of rules altogether. We don't want to get rid of boundaries altogether. We want to recognize that certain rules are very helpful. Certain rules can be played with and worked with, and other rules need to get modified and sometimes completely thrown out. So for the rules and role stage development, that's a complex experience for a human being. It's a complex experience for a culture, and we are always negotiating these guys. But in a healthy version of blue to orange, what we start to recognize is that I fit into somewhere at blue, at that blue rules and roles. I fit in somewhere, but they also have to realize that where I fit in can be a role oriented and rule oriented, and if I reflect upon myself, I also find out that there's more to me than just a single role or even just a few roles. I'm more than that. I'm something bigger, and I can also achieve more. I can look at my skill sets, and if I invest in my skill sets and refine them, I can then start to achieve amazing things. I can perform tremendous stuff. I can create amazing items. I can create amazing technology. And that's essentially what happens as we go through this process. Now, here in the States, shamanism shows up very much in the arts. So from blue to orange, it's like kicking in the arts, okay? So in this orange achiever self, the achiever or achievement self stage development is an important part of our experience. It's a part of our evolution where we come to realize that we have very specific skills and others, skills that are gifts, and we can refine those, and we can refine them so much to where they are amazing and profoundly helpful to the community. So we kind of get this idea of developing, and development on a large scale in a culture starts to look like a culture that starts to, emerge in very specific power expression ways. So they become a very science-based community, a very arts-based community, a very refined politically or economically or technologically. And the driving idea of the achievement self is act in your own self-interest by playing the game to win. So you participate in reality, you learn the rules and roles enough to where you can actually start to use those rules and roles to support your own self-interests and win the world, win success as far as that's concerned. And winning is of great importance. Achievement is of great importance. So we start to see cultures that emerge that are very meritocracy based. It's you win something, so you have a new privilege. You earn something, so you get a new privilege. You earn something and you get XYZ that's better than others. And so obviously there can be some inherent problems in a lot of this stuff. There's not a whole lot of sharing. There's not a whole lot of care for other human beings in certain situations. It's very self-focused and self-refinement focused and self-achievement focused. But also can be very, very, very powerful as human beings start to share their achievement with the community. So shamanism, in this experience, we start to see this evolution over the thousands and thousands of years into this era in humanity where altered states of consciousness become more and more refined. They start developing in a lot of different territories. You see the scientific world and the technological world starting to tap into these experiences more and more. So altered states of consciousness are, if ASCs and shamanic practices were demonized or condemned in a blue territory of the culture, as I move into that achiever self orientation, I may say, well, you guys don't like it, but I use it to get ahead. I use it to answer my questions. I use it to achieve my life. And the achievement can be material based, or it can be very interpersonal based. If I use these techniques to achieve inner peace or to achieve insight or achieve healing, then that's all good. That's great. That's fabulous. And if I use it for material pleasure, that's also fine too. So what we start to see emerging with altered states of consciousness is that you see artists via more and more sophisticated technological media start to show up and express this stuff. So it was happening prior to this, but it really kicks in as we see the orange stage of development unfold, because another reason why this starts to occur is because this, in a culture, the blue stage of development becomes so sophisticated and stable. We have enough resources, we're not being attacked on a regular basis. We're able to create institutions and educational systems. We have larger emergence of positive supportive systems. There may not be a whole lot of freedom or diversity in it, but there's definitely stability, and stability oftentimes and stability and easy access to resources and education gives way to greater refinement over a couple generations. You start to see more refinement emerge. Off of that stability launches a renaissance of opportunities of technology and resources and experiences and art and science and engineering. So at the orange stage of development for a culture, what we will notice most of the time is you will start to see a huge change in the values and a huge change of how they perform, which means in shamanism, you started to see the shamanic experience started to get translated into altered states of consciousness, passed off as high creative states or something like that. And you saw these high creative states starting to influence marketing, starting to influence the basic sciences, engineering, different types of technology, computer technology. You saw it impacting arts and the mediums of the arts, whether it be a change and shift as far as how we produce paint or produce musical instruments or produce writing utensils or the printing press, and how to distribute this art, ways, more creative and sophisticated ways for artists to collaborate with other schools of traditions in order to create more sophisticated art, theater, acting, movies, different things along those lines. So once again, a lot of shamanic stuff, a lot of shamanic tradition and activity starts to ebb and flow and becomes more and more refined and shows up where it's permissible. And I'm speaking very much about what happened here in the States. It started showing up in areas where it was perfectly welcome to be okay to be highly creative and thrown into creative states of consciousness. Now, the other reality here is that we started to see a major emphasis on science very strongly emerge in several Western cultures. And we started to see definitely this recognition that science, because it's verifiable and gives way to incredible material wealth or material items and sophistication, oftentimes starts to dwarf the spirituality or the shamanic experience from this territory. And unfortunately, what occurred in our American experience and portions of Europe was the shamanic experience was diagnosed by this, the early forms of psychology and psychotherapy, misdiagnosed as psychosis, misdiagnosed as a problem, as crazy. And so you had to be very careful about how you talked about your altered state experiences and what went on as far as that was concerned, even up into it's appalling to think about, but even up into like into the 80s, we were actually putting people in institutions because they were just having altered state experiences, and some of them are shit. Some of those people that were put in those institutions are still alive at this point in time. So it's very problematic, but as cultures are, no culture is fabulous, believe me. So as shamanism made it through this experience, there were definitely places that it was allowed to be, and it was also not allowed to be. So you couldn't be a politician talking about altered states of consciousness. Certain science in a lot of scientific communities, good Lord, since rational thinking and the rational mind was elevated to a almost godlike level after science attempted to kill and was interested in killing any kind of religious experience, the science community really took rational mind and rational thinking to a level of godliness, and it was problematic. And anything that wasn't looking like rational, normal thinking was then condemned as a problem and or crazy and or regressive and bad. And you could get in different layers of trouble in relationship to that. So it was super safe to experience shamanic experiences and altered states of consciousness down in this territory, in that low red, purple, beige type of a territory. That shit was normal and okay and perfectly fine. As soon as we start to move into that high red territory of sophistication, into that blue territory, you got to start really being careful about how you express those altered states of consciousness and what those things mean and how they live in that world. And especially here in the States or here in Western traditions, shamanism looked very like witchcraft. What the blue territory, what the Abrahamic traditions here in the States, Christian, Catholic, Baptist experience started to label as witchcraft because it was altered state based. Now you could definitely find, historically, you can definitely find priests and clergy persons who have altered state experiences coming from these blue stages of development, but since they termed it in a certain way and kind of held a certain position in the community, they were not persecuted in the same way as, say, a lay person, or in these feudal traditions and authoritarian territories, a person that was a little bit less categorically in their systems, in their hierarchical systems. They were just problematic. So anybody having those altered state experiences through these stages of development could be considered, you know, very, very dangerous. In the orange stage of development, the danger decreased, but it was still there. And how you talked about it was still mattered, but there was definitely this embrace of, in the arts and in certain territories, where the altered states of consciousness and a lot of the practices from shamanic traditions had evolved and changed to the point where you were relatively safe in certain ways, as long as you didn't try and cross over into different territories. So you couldn't do a bunch of altered states and having a lot of those experiences and really focus on that and really use that as an identifier as an artist, and then all of a sudden try and go into politics or into science. You'd probably run into a whole lot of trouble as far as that was concerned. But as far as the orange world was concerned, it was more free. It had more freedom in comparison to that blue stage development, because of the primary interest of the achiever self stage development is interested in becoming better, becoming more refined, and celebrating refinement and earning merits in order to be recognized as awesome and good and win the game, quote unquote. And so in the shamanic world, there was that same type of a thing. It was, I could use those shamanic altered state experiences in order to achieve great things. When we say great things, it could be a whole host of different goals. Depending on what you consider winning, you could do that. And as we kind of scooch on up into where we are very much these days, into that green sensitive self stage of development, what starts to occur is we start to recognize that the story of shamanism as being able to only live in certain territories in an authoritarian type of a world starts to emerge, and there's more flexibility for those altered state shamanic experiences showing up in a democratic world. A capitalistic democratic world, an achiever self type of a world has more flexibility to play and show up in different areas. A good example of that is a lot of what happened during the rise of computer technology, where you had a lot of computer science folks, computer engineer folks who were using ayahuasca or acid or mushrooms in order to have hallucinatory experiences and do journeys, essentially, in order to understand how to make a better microchip, or how to make a better processor, how to make a better computer, how to make a better laser, how to make a better, thruster for a booster rocket or something like that. So this was a thing that actually we saw very much during the 60s, 70s, and definitely in the 80s, where we started to ask that question very much so, like, what could we achieve through these altered states? And we had, for those that had access to technology, altered states of consciousness had really powerful effects on them and their ability to function and ability to perform their job. A wonderful example of this is what happened in basketball with the Chicago Bulls with Phil Jackson. Phil Jackson, the coach of the Chicago Bulls, was very much at this achiever self type of user of shamanic practices. He used meditation, he used breath work, he used yoga, he used a lot of concepts from Northern Native American traditions to kind of create a team and to win, in their case, the game of basketball, and achieve dominance in that territory. But he was a really a fair example of a orange user of shamanic practices in order to achieve the goals of the domain that he was living in. And so that's a great example. He's a really simple example of that. And that example is not uncommon. We have more than enough evidence suggesting that plenty of our great minds of the 60s, 70s, 80s on in technology definitely used altered states of consciousness to refine their arts or their technologies or their mathematics and systems and skill sets that they were focusing on. So you kind of see definitely this reemergence in this story that it's okay. You just have to, depending on the culture and the culture here in the States, you had to be careful about who you shared that with, or else you could possibly get in trouble. And definitely with those substances, all those substances were illegal, so you couldn't really broadcast that you were doing a whole lot of that stuff. But that was kind of how shamanism was manifesting in this orange world. For the green world, we started to see shamanism seeing if there was definitely a rebirth happening here of freedom to communicate or to explore those things. We definitely saw it emerging as more freedom here. So for this stage of development, for the green sensitive self, what emergence is that, yes, I can achieve great things, but part of achievement is people find that during achievement, they may have to sacrifice different portions of their being. And for the culture may do great and do amazing things and achieve incredible heights, but it might have been built on the backs of very, very, very subjugated people. And this is a great example of what we face in the US, which is the US has performed incredible feats of resource and technology and athletics and different domains like that, but it's been built on the backs of slavery and misogyny and xenophobia. It's just, there's a horrible story behind it. And we have to come to terms with that. So for the individual, the same thing kind of happens, is there's a self-reflection that may happen at this shifting point stage of development, where if I've achieved so many things, I may start to reflect on who I stepped on or who I screwed over as I was going through this stage of development of prosperity to achieve what I wanted to achieve. And so what then emerges is, as I'm self-reflecting on those things, I also notice, wow, I might have repressed portions of my own identity. I may have repressed portions of my own humanity achieving these things, and I want to let those back up. I want to bring those back into my life. So culturally and individually, you will start to see a focus of fairness, a focus of like creating, what's it called? Creating equanimity and vying for equity and working for fairness and healing transgressions, healing, making amends, and in some cases, reparations, depending on what the relationship looks like. So we see a lot of this at this stage of development for the culture and for an individual human. We start to see a very, very important return back to the sensitivity and the wholeness of our humanity and the fullness of our humanity. And this is a really beautiful stage of development. It's a really, really valuable to humans in the healing process, but it could not have happened. It doesn't seem to be an important thing until we've actually traveled through these blue, orange stages, purple, red, blue, orange stages, and get to this territory of looking back and saying, oh, wow, how did I get here? How does this feel? What's this about? And who did I screw over to get to my position of privilege? And that's a hard look. That's a difficult look upon oneself to say such things. And so shamanism, as it hit this territory, just starts to really, really, as we saw in the 70s, 80s, and very much in the 90s and aughts, a huge push into the rebirth and vivifying of shamanic practices and welcoming them into so many different territories and normalizing them as something to be honored for all kinds of different reasons. Yes, you can use them from an orange perspective to achieve. Yes, you can use them to fit in, and they're wonderful community builders at the rules and roles stage development as long as they're given permission and have healthy boundaries. Yes, you can totally use them for power, for understanding things, for finding your way through the world and finding your individuality. So all these things start to become more and more enmeshed in that green sensitive territory. And this is where most of us are dealing with shamanism at this point in time. This is very much where the world is at this point in time, and very much where ITB's version of shamanism really starts to relate. And shamanism here starts to include both contemporary experiences of shamanism as well as ancient experiences of shamanism. The big difference between our red, purple, beige shamanism and what we see as a rebirth here at the green stage development is the literal perspective of these things. So if green is healthy, if we have a healthy green going on in its relationship to shamanism, we still honor the power of the psychological experience, the phenomenological experience, the inner experience of this journey of shamanic practices and altered states. We very much honor that and honor the power that it can provide and whatnot. But at this stage, we are not seeing the literal. We are not carrying the literal experiences of, or the literal perceptions of, those earlier stages of beige and purple and red. We recognize there are not, we recognize that there is power in these experiences, but we are not wrapped up in magical thinking that if I say a magical incantation or a mantra, that it's automatically going to appear in place. We don't have those belief systems. Now, there are some sick versions of this that in the green stage development that have regressed downwards and use the term manifestation and use it in an inappropriate way to kind of mean word magic. And this type of manifestation, we at ITB don't support. That's not what we suggest is actually happening. And that can be a different conversation and as far as pitfalls of spirituality is concerned. But we kind of recognize that we can create environments, we can create our perspective, we can adjust our perspective to be more inclusive and more powerful. And part of that is part of that shamanic experience. But the big difference between these two territories is at the green stage development, it's seen as a metaphor. Stories, experiences, the practices of the shamanic experience are metaphors. They're stories that can be unpacked by the sophistication of our mind. They are not literal manifestations. So we recognize that is clear. Now, for a lot of folks at this sensitive stage development, the New Age community, that's a hard splitting of hairs. That's a difficult type of a conversation for them to have, mostly because there wasn't enough education throughout the process. They just kind of went from like a blue rules and roles type of a altered state experience and jumped right into and attempted to use this green stage of development language in order to interpret it. And that's dangerous. That's not a great idea. That can be very delusional, and that can cause people to have serious hiccups in relationship to manifestation. I see this a lot in the New Age community, where a individual may be saying all the right prayers or saying all the right mantra or doing all the right ritual or ceremony and yogic positions, but since they don't perform the activities, the physical activities of achieving said goal, nothing happens, and they believe that something's wrong with them. So this is a perfect example of kind of using the language of that green territory from a blue stage of spiritual orientation and just messing up the process, and kind of confusing oneself and maybe even creating psychosis for oneself and creating kind of a condemning obsessive mind in relationship to self. So one thing that happens for shamanism as we go from blue to orange is shamanism blue to orange, there's still physical activities. There's still the training that occurs. Orange spirituality is about practice. Orange spirituality is about refining one's practice, refining that process of our spiritual orientation beyond, in a very personal way, beyond the stories of the spiritual orientation that we come from, or the spiritual tradition we come from. So if we think of this from a yogic or a kung fu type of a perspective, the Kung Fu or yogic tradition suggests one thing is at blue about how you ought to do it, and you ought to, you know, get very good at that. And then as you get very good at that, you want to continue to move into that orange stage development of seeing how that forms you, how that changes you, how you can bring yourself to those forms even more richly and deeply and make it very interpersonal and very powerful. And then how then through that earning, through that refinement and enrichment, you then emerge into that green territory where you start to give up yourself. It's not just about achieving something special at the orange, it's about surrendering to a green experience of spirituality, a commitment to the community. You're surrendering those things, you do those activities to deepen and enrich your community, not just to, you know, achieve some material outcome or some special goal or merit that you have either come up with or that is awarded to by or awarded to you by a community. So if I practice my Kung Fu a lot, I start at the rules and rules Kung Fu experience of get your form right. And then I move to the orange, which is embody the form richly. And then as I achieve that, I move to the green stage of Kung Fu, which is embody that, perform that form incredibly, embody that form to the point where embodiment kind of disappears and you just disappear into the process, and you do that Kung Fu and you do that lifestyle and you do that practice in service of a community, of a greater good, not just yourself, because you've already stabilized yourself, you already balanced yourself, you've already learned the forms, you've already really stabilized yourself and benefited from it, and now you do it in order to offer it up to the community and support the community. So you see this emergence occur, and this is how shamanism kind of evolved through the years. And so as we get to this green sensitive self type of stage development, we see this major shift as how it's much more welcome in different areas. I mean, shit, at this day and age, we have yoga and meditation showing up in elementary schools. It's becoming more and more normalized in different territories. It's not uncommon to find a owner of a company or different types of athletes that are high end are doing meditation or doing yogic practices in order to, you know, reap the benefits and rewards of it based off of how they exist in these different territories. And so that's very, very kind of commonplace. The difference, and at this point in time, this is where we start to push into integral shamanism, where we use shamanism in ITB. And ITB is, for ITB, our interest is for all of these things to kind of hang in a sweet way. So we're integralists, which means that we don't look at one of these stages, the blue, the orange, or the green, and say, oh, that was it, and that's where we need to only focus on. So for us as integralists, we very much live by that conversation of, transcend and include, or transcend through inclusion. And so what we mean by that is that when it comes to being an integral shaman, what that means is that we recognize that all these stages need to be pushed into and explored very thoroughly in order for you to own this position of integral theory type of perspective. The other thing is that, especially at the green stage development, we see a lot of the return of identifiers. I want titles. I want to declare myself. I want to show that I am a part of a specific group or community. And so what we see here is also at the green stage development is a reminder that all these shamanic practices came from certain territories and certain places. So we suggest in integral transformative bodywork, you should be, as best as you can, honoring the forms of which these things come from. So if you have a North American, Native American education having to do with, like, for myself, a Lakota background, I have teachers that I've trained under that have Lakota backgrounds and have passed that stuff on. I don't identify myself as a Lakota shaman. This is kind of rude to the Lakota people, but I have been taught by Lakota practitioners, and I perceive myself as a carrier of those skill sets, but a actual world-centric, a world-focused type of a shamanic practitioner. So this is why we use the term world or integral shaman, because I also have training from shamanic traditions coming from Africa, coming from China, coming from South America. So I have education from these different places, and I hold all those as very sacred and very important. All those skill sets are super endearing and very important, and I want to honor those cultures and traditions as best as possible as a medicine carrier. But I don't only identify as one of those. Now, that can be controversial for some folks. That can be, that statement can make it sound like I am just kind of cherry picking stuff, or what is the derogatory version of culture vulture, maybe even as an appropriator. But the difference is that from where we're sitting in ITB, the difference is that we are dedicated to those traditions. We still honor those traditions. I still relate to those teachers. I still carry what they taught and identify it as that thing. I just don't throw it into a soup and be like, screw it, this is what I'm going to call it my own thing. What we're wanting to do is we're wanting to see this as the reality of, we honor specific traditions, but we also at the same time not only honor specific traditions and point to those specific traditions when it's time to point to them, but also hold that there is a collective orientation to altered states of consciousness on planet Earth, and kind of honor those two at the same time. And that's very much what an integral shaman does. That's very much what we are focusing on when it comes to an integral shamanism, is we're holding all these, we can hold contradictions relatively comfortably and see how they overlap and see them for their uniqueness as well. So this is one of the signs that we're living in an integral orientation, or we have an integral relationship to this material, because what appears to be true is, for the green sensitive self, they oftentimes have a hard time saying those things. They oftentimes have a hard time holding those contradictions in a graceful way. And so we have, so for that green stage development, they don't want to offend anybody. They don't want to be put in a position where anybody is less than anybody else. Everybody is supposed to be even and treated fairly, and not have any elitism or anything along those lines. And refinement oftentimes is poo-pooed upon. What emerges for the integral population, or for the integral shamanic practitioner, is a very difference from that. We keep the refinement and continue to refine our skills as we go through the sensitive self stage development. We honor fairness, but we also honor the uniqueness of everything as well. So we don't say everything is the same. We say there should be a performance of fairness and honor all different types of shamanic and spiritual practices and altered states. And there needs to be a recognition that some may be better than others, and that we can hold them and relate to them uniquely, but also see how they combine together. So these are, while this may seem like a splitting of hairs, it actually is a profoundly different orientation. There's much less stress at that integral self stage of development, in the integral self stage development mind, than there is in the sensitive self, because we can hold contradictions differently. We can honor the uniqueness of a culture and also see the global perspective, and walk that walk, not just talk it. Okay. And so what we're wanting to do is we're wanting to recognize that different stage of development. So in integral stage of development, for integral shamanism, what integral shamanism does, what's the primary interest is, we want to include all these stages of development in the conversation and honor that each one of them performs an important position in the shamanic experience. So we do want to know the rules and the rules of a tradition and varied traditions in order to understand how they are separate but also interconnect into another. We want to become very, very, very clean and clear and very refined with those techniques. Pointing to the orange stage of development if you can't see that. So we go from the blue to the refinement. We want to learn the rules and the techniques and the practices of those traditions and how they hang together. And then we also want to achieve and refine those practices and start to embody them and make them our own, and kind of allow them to change us, as well as communicate them in our own individual way. And we then also, very much as we move into that green stage, that achievement blossoms into this giving over to the community, this offering to the community, whether it be in a formal or informal way, it doesn't matter, but it's meant to be this offering up to the community and a bringing together experience rather than separating. So we, at the green stage development, we push against me just refining it, and we push into, how does this create community? How does this gel us together? How does this bring one world together? If we're all one people, how do we contribute these things to bring all of this together and see that the world is one? And then as we continue that activity, there's also this recognition of like, oh, wow, I can. Not all traditions are the same. Not all practices are the same. Some people did really good with, some groups of peoples did really good in one area. Others did really, really awesome in others. And certain traditions did really poorly in certain areas of altered states and shamanic practices, as we can translate them now. So what we find is that there's a much more, as we push into that integral stage of shamanism, what we find is a much more kind of sophisticated and much more nuanced experience of not only the stages that precede and an inclusion of the stages that precede, but we also see a recognition of diversity, but then also inclusion that's a little bit more radical and albeit complex than what we saw in that green sensitive stage of development. So that's how that journey occurs, and why we use this term in integral shaman in ITB. This is why we use this term integral shaman, because we're wanting to make sure, and in integral shamanic practices, we want to make sure we're clarifying what the big difference is. And hopefully, by me giving this lecture, you can see this tremendous difference of of different types of shamanism through history. One of the major hiccups that occurs, especially in this green and under type of territory, is as these emerge in both an individual and or a collective, they look at each other with disdain. So we look at sometimes our earlier stages of development or future stages of development, and we can look at them, or the group can look at each other, and they can see them as very problematic, as evil in some cases. All right. So you can have a blue-orange community that is very interested in maintaining a specific religious orientation and the rules of that religion, but then are also very interested in material items and achieving my goals and winning. As it looks to a green community, because it's very fluid and very dynamic and does not adhere to one book or one set of rules, and is willing to bend certain rules and altogether break certain rules that the blue-orange territory would not be interested in breaking, they can see them as evil. Okay, so a really simple example of this is a person who is very invested in a Christian Catholic tradition and says the stories and the rules of this tradition are the rules and don't you break them, looking at a very liberal LGBTQ community, or Black, Indigenous, persons of color community, and seeing that other community kind of bending the rules and outright breaking certain rules of that blue tradition, they will demonize them. They will condemn them because they are not living by their orientation of the world. And so it doesn't mean that these blue people are evil or horrible. It's just there's a confusion. There's a problem in this interaction with each other. Both of them are free to be there, because these green folks went through these earlier stages as well. They just might have gone through them a little bit different. But there's definitely a miscommunication between the stages. And there's definitely a difference in inclusivity at these different stages, okay? And there's the other unfortunate thing is that there's no certainty that people that are at this blue or orange stage are going to push into the next stage of development. So there's unfortunately no guarantees as far as these things are concerned, or how well that's going to unfold. A person at a blue or a blue partial orange stage of development may insist on a life that they are doing the right thing. And if there is any momentums to kind of push through into a more inclusive orange or a more inclusive green, they may reject it and repress it because they've been taught to condemn those activities. They don't see having a flexible moral orientation and being able to see nuance and being able to see contradictions and how to navigate those in a case-by-case basis. They don't see that as better. They don't see that as more sophisticated or more loving or more inclusive or more closer to higher power and more alive. They see that as a breaking of the rules. They see that as a flaw in character. And this is where we talk about the miscommunication and the misinterpretation. And so these stages can be at each other's throat. They can condemn each other. And the green stages, these inclusive and much more nuanced cultures, they can be just as shitty. They can look at the orange stage of development and see their material pleasure and their material stability and their ability to gain wealth and think that it's, you know, horrible, that it means they have no spirit, it means they have no soul, it means they are not connected to the same emotions and sensations and sensitivity that that green is experiencing. The green group, the green stage of development, can look at the blue and think they're ridiculous for following the rules in some book. How could you do that? That's such a horrible thing to do to yourself. Get free, man. You know, wake up, get out of that, get out of those confines, get out of the shackles of your religion, and, you know, get free. This is a lot of the language that starts to emerge with this, and you can imagine how problematic this shit can get in a culture where there's a lot of freedom and there's all these different stages going on. So when it comes to the shamanic experience and what shamanism is, there can be a lot of hangups, and some of these groups will burn each other for exploring shamanism in the shamanic experience or the altered states of consciousness at their stage. I mean, hey, you had shit, and during the witch trials, you had women who were exploring altered states of consciousness and had these really powerful connections to, you know, the natural world and whatnot, and were very scary to those blue stages of development. And they fucking burned them, man. That was just their orientation. You're threatening my community. You're threatening my way and my rules. And so our rules say we can kill you. So we're going to burn you, man. And so we can see how problematic this gets, and we can see how terrifying these things can start to unfold in these culture wars and these individual wars, how they can cause so much problems. You can have a family that has a person stable at each one of these, or very much identifying at each one of these stages of development, and they can be at each other's throats. And so for the shamanic experience, for what we consider integral shamanism recognizes all these stages as valuable within a certain domain and problematic within a certain domain. And we attempt to honor them as best as we can, but then also not get bound or pitfalled into their pitfalls and be careful about navigating that. It's a full-time fucking job, I can let you know also. So from the yellow or turquoise stage development, a lot of these things are just normal and basic for us. And it's something that that's how we live our lives from that place. So for integral shamanism, for what we do in ITB, we kind of hold all these stages of development as valuable, but then also always having problematic components of it. And we try and make sure that we walk that in a healthy fashion, and we live by that in a healthy fashion. So that's what we mean by integral shamanism, and that's what we mean by an integral shamanic practitioner, or integral shaman. That's very much what we're interested in. And they combine, the integral shaman combines the rules, the insights of science, technology, uses those things, recognizes things, recognizes how we can refine and achieve things, honors the different traditions, holds those contradictions, serves up their skill sets to the community in both formal and informal ways, and holds those as a collective, recognizes from that integral perspective, recognizes that this is all this stuff they have to enact and they have to embody in all these different stages in order to make sure that they are, you know, fully engaging the storyline of the process. And that's very much how an integral shaman works, and an integral shaman practitioner proceeds through the world. And so that's what we mean by that experience. Thank you very much. This has been a ton of information, as usual. This, as has been described before, this is like drinking from a water hose. So I'm very, very, very grateful for you participating. I hope that it landed relatively nicely for you. If you have any comments, please go to embodyingitb.org, go through our contact list, and just let me know what you're asking a question about. Of course, mention the video, which video you're talking about, and ask a question, or you can reach out to us here at ITB and going through our email. Just email us at embodyingitb@gmail.com and mention the video, mention what question you have, and we'll do our best to kind of answer that and handle your interests. My name is Jeff Koshin West. I hope you enjoyed it. Be safe, get plenty of rest, care for yourself, honor the stages of development, and I hope that they feed you in the way that they need to. We're in the midst of a pandemic, so I hope you make your way through that in a healthy and functional way. We love you very much, and we believe in you, and reach out if you need things, and we're here for you. We'll be back next Sunday, and let's see, what do we got? I don't even know what I'm doing next Sunday for this stuff. So we'll be back next Sunday at noon Eastern Standard Time to talk more about the shamanic experience and shamanism here in ITB. Okay? All right. Fare thee well, be wonderful, and take care.